Okay, so rolling? Yeah. Great. Sir, I just want to find out from you, how can regulators govern content in the internet age?
Okay, you ready? So how can regulators govern content in the internet age? It's an extraordinarily difficult problem, and it's a difficult time for regulators. A lot of the ways in which, let me do it again.
Yeah.
So how can regulators govern content in the internet age is a very difficult question. It's a particularly difficult time for regulators. The traditional approach of sort of either banning content or only having it on after certain times of the day, those sorts of approaches are being changed, undermined by the ability of our audiences to consume content on different devices like phones or online. So they're in charge of what time of day they consume things, and also they can be quite ingenious about getting access to content that they really want. So it's certainly not true that you can just apply the old-fashioned approaches. You can, of course, always ban content if you really want to. From experience, what tends to happen then is that the audience that really wants the content then really wants the content and goes and finds it anyway. So I think you have to find approaches which are about ensuring that people who make content behave in certain ways, setting standards for how they should behave, asking them to behave professionally. But you can't regulate all content made by people on their own mobile phones in the same way that you regulate content made by professional broadcasters. So you have to both have your broadcast type content regulation, and you have to think about issues of free speech, and you have to think about issues of defamation and the ability to protect privacy. So they're very big complex questions that are not just about regulating television.
Now, he comes from Uganda and I come from Kenya, and
right.
Both of our, we're neighbors, and we share the same views in regards to, say, gay and lesbianism,
right.
which is very popular in the Western world where you come from. But in Africa, we're very conservative about this emerging culture, which is already, and it's already in television, it's already in a lot of our content, music, etc. And you've talked about governing content in a very general perspective. But my question begs then, how then do these two, where do we draw the line? Where do we meet as content producers and people who regulate, because they are the moral police?
Yeah, I think that is the heart of the most difficult questions around regulation. And it doesn't really, in some ways it doesn't matter whether it's about gay and lesbian content or about politically difficult content. The questions are broadly the same. They're to do with who has the sort of consensus, who has the moral authority or the democratic authority to make those sorts of decisions. So it's not for me to judge the content of, should this be allowed in a country or not allowed in a country. You have to operate in the context of that country. I think then my approach would always be the same, which is that you have to both listen to what the audience and the wider culture is ready for, and that may not be the same in your countries, but very often, from my experience in the UK, the politicians are often behind the level of tolerance or the level of supportiveness of ordinary people like us, either because they have particular constituencies, groups who want them to believe a certain way, or because they genuinely are very strong believers in something. But I've tended to find that when you talk to the ordinary people, they don't tend to be quite so extreme as maybe some of the politicians. But that all relies on talking to people about their views and having an open debate. And it is to some extent the media's job to challenge and to open up new opportunities to consider those debates. So I think I don't think societies progress by pushing down difference and diversity. I think if you want a clear example of that, in the West we're having, and particularly in the States, we're having very major racial diversity debates at the moment, which have been suppressed for far too long, and equality debates which have been suppressed for far too long. And so I don't think anything really progresses by that kind of suppression. So I would always advocate listening to what people think, staying aware of what they think, and politicians possibly being a little bit more aware of what's happening in their country than just stay in their party or amongst people like them.
Okay. Final question, sir. How can creative technology be used in education?
So creative technologies in education is a real passion of mine. I think you can use both the ability to deliver learning materials using media, using games, using TV, using video, and that has the potential to engage certain kinds of learners and to provide certain kinds of information. I don't think it does everything, so there's a real need still for reading and collaborating and working in teams and those sorts of skills, but I think many of our classrooms around the world, a teacher would recognise, if a teacher from 100 years ago came into a British classroom 10 years ago, they would have recognised the room. It would have felt very similar and familiar to them. Whereas if a surgeon from 100 years ago had walked into a hospital operating theatre 10 years ago, would have been a completely different thing. So I think the use of media in schools is important, but also crucially the ability of children and young people to create using the creative tools. So my children often create their own videos, they create their own presentations as part of their schoolwork and their presentations and the way they are assessed. I think we can do more of that. And I'm always amazed by the level of, not my children, but generally children's ability to understand and create media, which we would think were much more professional skills than it turns out perhaps they are. So I think it's partly about using media to deliver educational content, and it's partly about making the educational experience more engaging and more interactive and more sort of empowered for the children by using technology. But I'm not an advocate that technology replaces the traditional ways of teaching. I think everything needs to be in a balanced blend.
Yeah, you said something like the way you drive content will remain important regardless of technology.
Yep.
And yet we are discussing here technology as a disruptor.
Yep.
How do those two relate in that context?
So I talked about, in my speech, I talked about how the way in which content is successful remains to some extent constant, regardless of technology. So it is to do with it connecting at a human level. It is to do with sometimes it giving you something to talk about with your peer group, or something for you to talk about which makes you stand out, that you know that other people don't know. Lots of reasons that we engage with stories and content. I think those are what are eternal. I think new things, new capabilities, like the ability to interact with content, are changing the way we do those things, but I don't think they're changing the eternal aspects, the same things that have made stories survive from the campfire, that have made the great religions of the world be passed down from generation to generation. They have resonance, they have something to teach us today, they have something which allows us to identify our own selves and our culture. I think these new technologies will do those things. They do them in different ways, and that makes it sometimes difficult for those of us who've grown up with some technologies. There's a tendency for us to think that the way we told stories will always be the best because it's the way we told stories, and I don't think that's ever been true, and I don't think it will become true.
So to what extent, lastly, should then content respond to the realities of changing technology, or at all, or should they respond at all?
So how should content respond to changing technology? Well, first, I don't really like thinking of it as content. So content suggests it's kind of held in a sort of glass, ready for somebody to drink it. I think what we're really doing is creating experiences and connections for people. And so if you think of content like that, a lot of the new technologies really, not even the new technologies, a lot of digital technologies make that even more possible and even easier to do. And they make it possible for new people and different people to tell their stories. Social media and YouTube are obvious examples. And there are negatives from that, but there are also extraordinary positives from it. So content has always, or human experience has always been related to technology. And that goes as far back as the ability to depict that there is a waterhole just over there in Namibia by drawing on a wall 10,000 years ago. That's a technological act of remembering and of sharing information. It's different to today, but that was a technological capability at that point in time, which is still doing something that we're still doing today. I might WhatsApp you in a moment to say, shall we have a beer later? And there would have been a different way of doing that 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. the essence is, shall we go and have a beer?
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you.